The leather DPS comparison, finally here by major request. Note that this is completely my opinion though, and will be based on the fun that I had with each spec, not so much the damage. Will damage be mentioned? Yes, obviously, it's damage roll, and I will mention damage at some point of the vid. Going forward, I didn't think it was fair to put the Boomkin in. The rankings just don't seem to fit it, guys, since it's the only range. That being said, if I did, it would be towards the middle, only by the fact it's artifact ability. Out of all the leather DPS, it felt like it had some rotational gameplay due to its artifact ability, as where the rest of them are kind of fire and forget. But really, there's not a whole hell of a lot that the Boomkin can really end up doing in this situation, but think if you were to end up looking for it, it'd be somewhere down the middle, guys. Other than that, most of the gameplay with the Boomkin felt very bland in comparison to some of the others. So that leaves us with all three rogue specs: Havoc Demon Hunter, the Feral Druid, and the Windwalker Monk. Where do they lie in my rankings? Let's find out, starting with number 6. The Feral Druid. Unfortunately, the Feral Druid to me is not the greatest of specs. The patience this spec requires leaves me at a dull loss of what to do next, as my mind goes blank and I fade into the distance, losing some interest quickly. That's not the case for a lot of people, but that constant shred, rake, rip combo leaves me dry, even with adding in all the other prep items like Savage Roar, Bloody Talons, and Tiger's Fury to massively increase damage through your bleeds. The slow regeneration of energy made me feel like I wasn't even going to make another 5-point finisher unless the artifact came back up to give me the 3 instant combo points. Is this a bad spec? Not at all. Damage felt very good, and will only get better in a patient player's hands that knows how to take the time and maximize their bleed damage with this spec. And the good part, if you play a Feral Druid on live, you've played it in Legion. Very little has changed with this spec except for some core abilities taking their place in the talent tree like Savage Roar. This thing plays the same, guys. You're going to want to keep up your Rake, you're going to want to keep up your Rip, you're going to want to end up using Shred as your main combo point generator. Not a whole lot's been changed here. Berserking plays exactly the same to a point that it's on a 3-minute cooldown and you're really getting some interesting pieces. You do have some additional talent choices that are quite obvious on where they're supposed to be used, either in AoE situations, single target, or just general ease of use. There's a lot of different variation to this spec, but it still did not seem to fill the void of where my gameplay would be. If I had to play just this spec alone, I would more than likely personally have to quit WoW because it is not my cup of tea. That being said, like stated before, that's not the case because there are a lot of people out there that still really enjoy the Feral Druid and its gameplay style. You have to be a very patient person to play this spec. And with this, let's move on to number 5. The Outlaw Rogue. This spec had its fun moments. When everything would line up from Roll the Bones, it would take off and just had an overall great feeling. The bad part was, well, few and far in between, unfortunately. This didn't happen a lot. It was a very huge change to where you would end up getting this one time where everything lit up and you'd be a god amongst men, and then most of the time you'd end up with just Jolly Roger and have to re-roll anyways. The spec is still based completely around what your live combat feels like though. With a few good additions, pistol shot procs feel very much like live assassinations, dispatch procs, giving that additional gameplay change in the rotation, so you do have a little bit of a break in sanity there. A few spells work the same as on live. Saber Slash is going to be Sinister Strike, Run Through is your new Eviscerate, and etc. guys. Most of it has just had names to where they've been changed. The part that turned me off of this spec was the gamble the Outlaw takes in every single fight with Roll the Bones. This ability is literally a gamble at your performance, taking the RNG factor to its limits with this spec. If you're lucky enough with it, the damage will be extremely promising. If not, it's garbage. It takes the actual skill in the gameplay completely away, as you spend most of your time fishing for the better rolls and taking chances with this spec. I'm not a gambling man, and now that this spec that's all it's about. Really, the spec is all about gambling. It is an outlaw. That is what they do. They end up gambling. You're a pirate. You're going to shoot somebody. You're going to gamble. You're going to run them through. You're going to do everything on a savage level. And gambling is one of them. So if you really enjoy it, roll the dice and pray that RNGesus is with you. And with that, we're going to go on to number 4. The Assassination Rogue. This thing is by far a 180 from combat. Ultimately fitting its class fantasy, this spec was more or less made to assassinate one target at a time, leaving its AoE capabilities a bit lacking even through talents. The only spec out of the rogue left with poisons, unfortunately, that seemed very undertuned. The poisons were not there in most of my testing. They didn't feel good unless I went with agonizing poison over deadly poison, but recently I've seen that they've had a few buffs, so this may be okay now. But that's okay, because you can make the target bleed out by using both Garrote and Rupture, and then buffing this bleed damage with Hemorrhage to do some pretty amazing bleed damage over time. This spec, compared to Outlaw, was much better on the damage performance simply because it was more baseline, it was straightforward. I felt the spec had a fairly decent rotation with good timing and building up to use your artifact at the right times when you'd be able to go straight into a good Envenom rotation and help boost the damage of Kingsbane to give it a good play style. But that was about it. After a while of doing this generalized rotation, it was very structured. I found myself getting bored. As there was no flavor to change my damage, just the same finishers and general rotation continued to repeat. The loss of Dispatch proc really made this very methodical compared to how it is on live, and eventually started to bore me over time. With that, guys, we're going to move on to number 3. The Windwalker Monk. This spec has a multitude of abilities to keep it fairly interesting, and the new mastery keeps you thinking until the mental agility kicks in, and it becomes a general rotation. As mentioned, the mastery is made to increase your damage as long as you keep hitting a different damaging ability and never repeat the same damaging ability twice. An example, your mastery, if you end up, you're going to do just additional damage on top of each ability. They're going to do extra damage. If you end up going, let's say, Tiger's Palm, then you're going to go Rising Sun Kick, Tiger's Palm, Fist of Fury, Tiger's Palm, Blackout Kick, and so on and so forth. And you're always going to see that Tiger Palm balance in there as to keep your balance in chi and energy. This makes for an interesting play, as you will always hit a different button and never spam the same thing. The closest you will come to this is every other button you may hit, Tiger Palm again, like mentioned, to keep your chi up and your energy from capping. That's basically what you're looking at. You don't want to end up having your energy cap because that's a DPS loss, and you don't want to have your chi cap because that's a DPS loss. So this plays very nice. Still having Rising Sun Kick, Fist of Fury, and Blackout Kick as chi spenders, there are many ways to promote additional damage to this spec. Most of the chi spender abilities do have cooldowns, but they can definitely be reduced by haste quite effectively. If you like a spec where you can always do something and keep a fast-paced rotation going, this is a good place to start. And with that, guys, we're going to move on to number 2. The Havoc Demon Hunter. To put this in the best way I can, this spec sucked when I started it. Barely having anything to do, but as I leveled it to 110 and started unlocking more and more abilities through talents, it progressively got better. With more gameplay choices and thinking than some of the other classes that I have previously mentioned, this spec starts as a simple 2-button spec in its main rotation, and eventually ends up being a 5 to 6 button rotation. The downfall to this spec is its 5-minute cooldown, Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis turns you back into that 2-button rotation for 30 seconds in order to maximize single target damage output. It really kind of sucks that you're going back to that 2-button rotation. With your main damage being from Annihilation, the chance, if you crit with it, you use no fury. so it may sometimes even be closer to a one-button monster in some of the better damage cases. If you got a ton of crit, that's going to be the situation. So with that aside, at level 110, this thing opens up a whole new world of how to increase your damage or keep it simple. It will really depend on the person playing and their playstyle, but with choices to add in abilities like Fell Rush and Fell Eruption, you can really modify your gameplay for some great increase in damage. The spec does very well in single target rotation and is quite fun. And you max out when you do max out your abilities, you know, it gets way better, way better. When you leave it baseline, it's pretty boring. Heavy mobility, good damage, and just fun animations. This thing is great to watch as you damage also. You see some pretty insane movement on this spec, even though you're really technically not going anywhere. It's fun, the animations are great, and it just seems like an all-in-all good spec. In AoE, this thing gets even better though. Lining up I-beams correctly, making sure to add Blade Dance into your rotation on 2+ mobs for added damage, it just gets really fun. All in all, guys, though, for this new hero class, it starts off very, very slow, but progressively turns into a fun monster of specs, earning that title of the hero spec. And with that, let's finally see number 1. The Sub-Rogue! Yes, Subtlety. Truly the master of shadows. This spec started the alpha off rough, but has since changed into something amazing in my eyes. Sub has had many ways to improve damage, and many things to maintain and track, that if played right, you never get bored. To some, this may be too much to track, with all your buffs that you gotta maintain, your dots, shadow dance procs, vanish, and general CDs to make them line up for some insane damage, but I really enjoyed learning this new design spec. With the change to Shadow Dance, it adds an additional rotation on your core rotation to manage. Popping into Shadow Dance to either rebuff yourself or just take advantage of another quick burst period will really depend on how your buffs look and how many charges of Shadow Dance you have available. Very awesome game choices come from this spec, making it extremely fun to play. This is another spec that will either dominate in the right hands or flop in the wrong ones, as it takes some real work getting used to managing Shadow Dance. It really does. Knowing exactly where you want to play this thing, you're really going to have to learn the fight and how much time you've got left. There's so much that goes into really playing this spec. But I did notice single target and AoE, I had no problems with this spec whatsoever, as it performed well in AoE but felt best single target. So there you have it. Again, this is just my opinion on the specs, and if you would like to learn more about each spec, you can click on the links to take you right to my full reviews of each spec that will give you more information on the changes. Being beta, they were up to date at the time, and since May have changed. So just keep that in mind, guys, but they will still be relatively close to what we have out there. Remember to always make a decision for yourself, as people play and think differently on what they like. Pre-patch will more than likely be coming soon, so you will have the chance to test these before Legion actually comes live. And with that, as always, I hope you enjoyed yourself, and thanks for watching.